When I was 13, my mother smiled while measuring my shoulders with a tailor's tape. She said she wanted my next dress to fit perfectly for a special family celebration. I smiled back, but deep inside I knew that dress wasn't meant for a birthday or a holiday. In my family, every celebration came with expectations. Every compliment carried a hidden purpose. Every tradition quietly reminded us that our lives were never truly our own. Growing up, I never questioned any of it because everyone around me accepted it as normal. The older girls disappeared one after another, and a few weeks later we'd hear they had started their new lives. Nobody explained what those words really meant. Whenever I asked too many questions, my mother would gently place her hand on my shoulder and say, "One day you'll understand why our family does things differently." I believed her because I didn't know anything else. We had lived in Arizona since before I was born. Outside our front door was modern America, but inside our house everything followed rules that felt much older. There were rules for how to speak, how to walk, how to sit, how to serve food, even how long you were allowed to laugh. I learned early that interrupting an older relative was disrespectful. Looking directly at a man while speaking was considered rude. Asking why too often meant a long lecture about loyalty and family honor. By the time I turned 11, I could prepare dinner for 20 people without making a mistake. I knew exactly how every uncle liked his tea and how every aunt expected the table to be arranged. If something wasn't perfect, nobody yelled. Instead, they reminded me for hours that a good daughter never settled for almost right. The criticism hurt more than shouting ever could. Still, I smiled through all of it because smiling made everyone believe I was happy. School became the only place where I felt like an ordinary teenager. For 7 hours each weekday, nobody cared how I folded towels or whether I poured drinks correctly. My classmates talked about sports, music, college, vacations, and future careers. I listened quietly, pretending I had dreams like theirs. Then one afternoon, everything changed. During history class, our teacher asked everyone to write about where we saw ourselves 10 years in the future. Students around me filled entire pages. One wanted to become a doctor. Another dreamed of opening a restaurant. Someone wanted to travel the world before settling down. I stared at my blank paper for almost 20 minutes. Then I realized something that frightened me more than I wanted to admit. I had never imagined my own future. Not because I lacked ambition, but because I had quietly accepted that those decisions would never belong to me. In the end, I wrote only one sentence. I don't know if I'm allowed to choose. When class ended, my teacher gently asked me to stay behind. I immediately assumed I had done something wrong. Instead, she simply asked, "Can I ask you something? Are you happy at home?" The answer came automatically. "Yes." She nodded, almost like she expected that response. Without arguing, she walked to a cabinet and placed several brochures on her desk. They covered topics like student rights, youth resources, counseling services, and legal protections for teenagers. She didn't push them toward me or tell me to take one. She simply said, "If you ever have questions about your future, these might help." As I gathered my backpack, one title caught my attention: "Your future is yours." I couldn't explain why those 4 words stayed with me all afternoon. That evening, after everyone in the house had gone to sleep, I turned on the flashlight from an old phone and read every page under my blanket. It talked about personal rights, education, legal protections, and organizations that helped teenagers who felt trapped by situations beyond their control. Every page challenged something I had believed my entire life. I read it once, then again, then a third time. Before hiding it inside my biology textbook, I memorized every phone number printed on the back. Over the next month, I spent every free moment in the school library. I searched for laws, youth programs, scholarship opportunities, and stories about people who had built lives different from the ones expected of them. For the first time, I realized there were thousands of girls whose futures hadn't been chosen for them. They had chosen for themselves. That single idea refused to leave my mind. Then one evening, while carrying a tray of tea toward the living room, I heard my father speaking with 2 relatives. I wasn't trying to listen, but one sentence stopped me in my tracks. "She's almost old enough," one man said. My father answered calmly, "The Harrison family has already expressed serious interest. We won't keep them waiting much longer." My heart started pounding. I stood frozen in the hallway, barely breathing. A second voice laughed quietly before asking, "Do you think she'll accept it?" My father didn't hesitate. "She won't need to. She trusts us." I quietly walked back toward the kitchen before anyone noticed me standing there, but something inside me had changed forever. Until that moment, everything had been uncomfortable, confusing, and restrictive. Now it suddenly felt urgent. For the first time in my life, I wasn't simply wondering whether my future belonged to someone else. I realized there was a real chance that decisions about the rest of my life were already being made, without me even being in the room. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd overheard. Every conversation at breakfast suddenly sounded different. Every glance between my parents felt like it carried a secret I wasn't supposed to know. My father smiled as he read the morning news, my mother hummed while preparing coffee, and everything looked perfectly normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that my future had quietly become a topic of discussion while I wasn't even invited into the room. At school, I found myself reading the same paragraph in my textbook over and over without understanding a single word. My history teacher noticed immediately. After class, she stopped me in the hallway. "You look exhausted," she said softly. "Everything okay?" I almost repeated my usual answer. "I'm fine." But the words wouldn't come out. Instead, I simply nodded without saying anything. She studied my face for a moment before handing me a small notebook. "If talking feels difficult," she said, "sometimes writing is easier." I slipped it into my backpack and thanked her before heading home. That notebook became my secret. Every night after everyone was asleep, I filled its pages with thoughts I'd never dared to say out loud. I wrote about the rules inside our house, about the constant pressure to be perfect, about hearing adults discuss my future as though I wasn't a real person. The more I wrote, the more I realized something important. None of it sounded normal anymore. A week later, my parents announced we would be hosting a large family dinner that Saturday. Relatives from several cities were coming, along with special guests. My mother insisted I wear the new dress she'd been working on. She spent hours making sure every detail looked perfect. "First impressions matter," she reminded me, "especially this weekend." That sentence made my stomach tighten. Saturday arrived faster than I wanted. By late afternoon, our house was full of voices, laughter, and the smell of homemade food. Cars filled both sides of the street. People I barely recognized greeted me as though they'd known me forever. Several older women complimented my dress and whispered to my mother with approving smiles. I noticed strangers among the guests, too. A well-dressed couple around my parents' age, accompanied by a young man who looked several years older than me. Every few minutes someone glanced in my direction before quietly continuing their conversation. It felt less like a family gathering and more like an interview I hadn't agreed to attend. During dinner, my father asked me to bring dessert into the dining room. As I placed the plates on the table, the unfamiliar couple smiled politely. The woman looked at me and said, "Your parents must be very proud." Before I could answer, my father spoke for me. "She has always respected our family's values." Everyone nodded in agreement. I forced a smile and continued serving dessert, but inside I felt my heartbeat getting faster. Later that evening, I stepped outside onto the back patio for some fresh air. My younger cousin Lily quietly followed me. She looked nervous. "Can I tell you something?" she whispered. I nodded. She glanced toward the house to make sure nobody was listening. "They're talking about you." My chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Lily swallowed hard. "I heard Aunt Nora telling Grandma that tonight is only the beginning. They're planning another dinner next month, just for both families." "What families?" I asked, even though I already suspected the answer. "Yours and theirs." She pointed discreetly toward the unfamiliar guests inside. My hands started shaking. "Are you sure?" she nodded. "I wasn't supposed to hear it." Before I could ask anything else, we heard my mother's voice calling our names from inside. Lily hurried back as though nothing had happened. I stayed outside for another minute, staring into the dark backyard. For the first time, I wasn't imagining possibilities anymore. I realized I had a deadline, even if nobody had told me what it was. Whatever my parents were planning, it had already begun, and if I wanted my future to be my own, I couldn't wait much longer. That night, sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the conversations happening downstairs without me. I kept replaying my cousin's words over and over. They're planning another dinner, just for both families. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I knew enough to understand I was running out of time. The following Monday, I stayed after school and went straight to the library. Instead of doing homework, I searched for information about scholarships, youth programs, and legal resources for teenagers. I wasn't planning to run away. Not yet. I just wanted to know what my options were. For the first time in my life, I realized having information made me feel stronger. Nobody at home could control what I knew. Over the next 2 weeks, I quietly built my own routine. I memorized important phone numbers instead of saving them. I learned where the nearest community center was. I found out which counselor was always available during lunch. None of this felt dramatic. It simply felt smart. At home, however, the atmosphere slowly changed. My mother suddenly became unusually cheerful. She complimented my cooking more often. My father started asking about my grades, something he had never shown much interest in before. Even my aunts treated me differently during family visits. At first I thought maybe I had imagined everything. Then one Friday evening my mother knocked on my bedroom door carrying several dresses. "Try these on," she said with a smile. "We're taking family photos next weekend." Family photos? That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that she'd bought 3 expensive dresses instead of one. As I changed into the first outfit, I overheard her talking on the phone in the hallway. "Yes," she said quietly. "She's growing into a wonderful young woman. They'll be very impressed." My hands froze on the zipper. "They'll be very impressed." The same phrase echoed in my head all evening. Saturday afternoon, we drove across town to a large house I'd never visited before. My parents told me it belonged to old family friends. The moment we arrived, I realized this wasn't just another social visit. Everything looked carefully planned. A photographer was already setting up equipment in the backyard. Tables were decorated with flowers. People kept introducing themselves to me even though I couldn't remember meeting any of them before. During dinner, the same young man I'd seen at our previous gathering sat directly across from me. He was polite enough, asking about school and my favorite subjects, but the conversation felt strangely rehearsed. Every time either of us answered a question, our parents exchanged satisfied smiles. I barely touched my food. On the drive home, nobody spoke for several minutes. Finally, my father broke the silence. "What did you think of Daniel?" My stomach dropped. I chose my words carefully. "He seemed nice," my father nodded. "That's what matters." Nothing else was said, but I understood the message. This wasn't about making new friends. They were already imagining a future I hadn't agreed to. Monday morning, I walked into school feeling completely different. The hallway looked the same. The classrooms looked the same. Now they felt like the only place where my own choices still existed. During lunch, I finally gathered enough courage to visit the guidance counselor. I almost turned around twice before reaching her office. She welcomed me with a warm smile and asked what was on my mind. For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. Then I said something I'd never admitted out loud before. "I think people are making plans for my future, and nobody has asked what I want." She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush me. She simply listened. By the time the lunch bell rang, I had shared more about my home life than I had ever told another person. When I finished, she looked at me kindly and said, "You deserve to have a voice in your own future." Those words stayed with me for the rest of the day. For the first time, someone hadn't told me what I should do. They reminded me that I had the right to choose. I walked out of her office feeling a little less afraid. But deep down, I knew that once my family realized I was beginning to think for myself, everything at home was about to change. The changes began so gradually that, at first, I questioned whether I was imagining them. My parents suddenly wanted to know exactly where I was after school. If I stayed 10 minutes late to finish a project, my phone would buzz with a message asking when I'd be home. If I mentioned studying with classmates, my mother would offer to drive me herself. What had once felt like strict parenting now felt like constant supervision. One afternoon, I noticed something else. My bedroom door had been left slightly open. I always closed it before leaving for school. At first, I ignored it. Then I looked closer. The notebook my teacher had given me wasn't where I'd hidden it. It was only a few inches out of place, but enough for me to notice. Someone had searched my room. My heart raced as I flipped through the pages. Nothing appeared to be missing, but from that moment on, I stopped writing anything personal. Instead, I memorized everything important and kept my thoughts to myself. A few days later, my father surprised me by announcing we would all be attending another family gathering the following weekend. "It's important," he said. "Everyone expects us to be there." The moment we arrived, I recognized several of the same faces from before. Daniel and his parents were there again, along with more relatives than I could count. During dinner, the adults talked loudly while I quietly listened. Then my aunt raised her glass and smiled at me. It's wonderful watching young people prepare for the next chapter of life. Several people looked directly at me before quickly looking away again. I felt my stomach sink. After dinner, I stepped outside onto the back porch, hoping for a few minutes alone. Instead, Daniel walked out a few moments later. "Mind if I join you?" he asked politely. I nodded. For a minute, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "I don't think either of us chose this." I looked at him, surprised. He sighed. "My parents have been talking about our families for months." "Did they tell you?" I asked quietly. "Not directly," he admitted, "but you hear enough conversations and eventually you figure things out." That answer caught me off guard. He didn't seem arrogant or controlling. He looked uncomfortable, almost trapped. "What do you want?" I asked. He stared across the yard before answering. "Honestly, I wanted to finish college before thinking about any of this." For the first time that evening, I realized he wasn't the person making these decisions either. Before we could continue, my father opened the back door. "There you two are," he said with a broad smile. "Everyone's waiting." The conversation ended as quickly as it had begun. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about what Daniel had said. Maybe both of us were being pushed toward a future neither of us had planned. Monday morning, I went straight to the guidance counselor's office before first period. She noticed the worry on my face immediately. "Something happened?" she asked. I nodded. "I think my parents are making decisions that affect my future, and I don't know how much time I have before they expect me to agree." She listened carefully before asking a simple question. "Have they actually told you what those plans are?" I hesitated. "No." "Then don't assume," she said gently. "But don't ignore your instincts either. Keep paying attention. If you ever feel pressured into something you don't want, tell someone immediately. You don't have to face it alone." Those words gave me a little hope. Still, as I walked through the school hallway later that afternoon, my phone vibrated with a message from my mother. "Come straight home today. We need to talk as a family." I stared at the screen for several seconds. My instincts told me that whatever conversation was waiting at home would change everything. I walked home slower than usual that afternoon, reading my mother's message at least a dozen times. "We need to talk as a family." It sounded harmless, but something about it made my stomach tighten. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed the house was unusually quiet. No television, no music, no laughter from the kitchen. My parents were already sitting in the living room waiting for me. My mother smiled warmly and motioned for me to sit beside her. My father folded his hands and looked at me with a calm expression I'd learned to be cautious of. "You've been doing very well in school," he began. I thanked him, unsure where the conversation was going. "Your teachers say you're responsible," he continued. "Mature, respectful." I nodded again, then he smiled. "That's why we believe you're ready to start thinking seriously about your future." My heartbeat quickened. My mother reached for my hand. "Every family reaches an important moment," she said gently. "This is ours." She spoke as though she were announcing wonderful news. "We've spent many months getting to know a family we deeply respect." I already knew who she meant. "The Harrisons have raised an outstanding son," my father added. "He's hardworking, educated, and comes from a family that shares our values." Neither of them asked what I thought. They simply continued explaining how fortunate I was. My mother described how kind Daniel's parents had been. My father talked about trust, stability, and family reputation. It felt less like a conversation and more like a presentation that had been carefully rehearsed. Finally, my father leaned forward. "We're not asking you to make any decisions tonight," he said. "We simply want you to spend more time getting to know Daniel." I wanted to ask why that decision had already been made without me. Instead, I quietly asked, "What if I don't want that?" The room became completely silent. My mother's smile disappeared first. My father stared at me for several long seconds before answering. "Sometimes we don't immediately recognize what's best for us. But shouldn't I get to decide?" I asked carefully. His expression hardened just enough for me to notice. "Your mother and I have spent our entire lives making sacrifices for this family," he replied. "We would never guide you toward something that wasn't in your best interest." It wasn't really an answer. After dinner, I went upstairs and closed my bedroom door. For the first time, I locked it. I sat on the edge of my bed, replaying every word. They hadn't threatened me. They hadn't yelled. They hadn't even raised their voices. Somehow that made everything feel even heavier. They believed they were doing the right thing, and if I simply stayed quiet, events would continue moving forward exactly as they had planned. The next morning, I arrived at school exhausted. During lunch, my guidance counselor immediately noticed something was wrong. Did the conversation happen? She asked. I nodded. They want me to start spending time with someone they chose. She listened without interrupting. Did they give you a choice? I looked down at my hands. It sounded like I had one, but it didn't really feel like it. She took a deep breath before speaking. You deserve the chance to decide what kind of future you want. No matter how much your family loves you, your voice matters too. Before I left her office, she handed me a small card with several phone numbers on the back. You may never need these, she said. I hope you don't. But if you ever feel overwhelmed, or if you ever believe your choices are no longer your own, there are people who will listen. I slipped the card into my wallet. Walking back toward class, I felt a strange mix of fear and determination. For months, I had quietly gathered information. Now I realized something else. Information alone wasn't enough. Sooner or later, I would have to make a choice. And deep down, I was beginning to understand that whichever choice I made would change not only my future, but my relationship with my family forever. The days that followed felt strangely peaceful, and that worried me more than anything. My parents stopped bringing up Daniel altogether. There were no more conversations about families, no more comments about the future, no more carefully planned dinners. It was as if the subject had disappeared overnight. Part of me wanted to believe they had changed their minds. Another part knew my parents too well. They never abandoned a plan without replacing it with another one. One Friday evening, my mother walked into my room carrying a shopping bag. I thought we could spend tomorrow together, she said with a smile. Just the two of us. I hadn't heard those words in years. Saturday morning, she took me to a shopping center across town. We ate lunch together, browsed bookstores, and even laughed about a few embarrassing childhood memories. For several hours, everything felt normal. I almost forgot the conversation we'd had a few weeks earlier. On the drive home, my mother broke the silence. You know, she said, keeping her eyes on the road, parents don't always get everything right. I looked at her surprised. Really? She smiled softly. Of course, we make mistakes too. Hope flickered inside me. Maybe she understood how I felt. Maybe things were actually changing. Then she added, but sometimes children mistake love for control because they don't have enough life experience yet. The hope disappeared just as quickly as it had arrived. She wasn't apologizing. She was trying to convince me that I simply didn't understand. When we got home, I found my father waiting in the living room. He looked pleased. How was your day? He asked. It was nice, I answered honestly. Good, he replied, because next weekend you'll be joining Daniel and both of our families for dinner again. My heart sank. Nothing had changed after all. Monday morning, I told my guidance counselor everything. She listened carefully before asking, has anyone ever directly asked you what you want? I thought about it for a moment. My parents had asked whether I liked the food, whether I enjoyed school, whether I wanted new clothes, but when it came to the biggest decisions in my life, no, I admitted quietly. She nodded. Then maybe it's time someone does. She leaned forward. What do you want? It sounded like such a simple question, yet I had no immediate answer. Not because I didn't know. Because nobody had ever expected me to answer it before. After a long silence, I finally whispered, I want to finish school. I want to go to college. I want to decide my future when I'm ready. Saying those words out loud felt strangely powerful. For the first time, they weren't just thoughts inside my head. They were real. The counselor smiled. Those are reasonable goals. Before I left, she suggested creating a safety plan, not because she believed something terrible would happen, but because she wanted me to know my options. We wrote down emergency contacts, trusted adults, community resources, and places I could go if I ever felt unsafe or pressured. She reminded me that having a plan didn't mean I would need it. It simply meant I wouldn't have to make important decisions while panicking. That afternoon, as I walked toward the school parking lot, I noticed a familiar SUV parked across the street. My father rarely came to pick me up. He usually worked late. I slowed my pace. He stepped out of the vehicle and waved with a smile. Thought I'd surprise you, he called. I forced a smile back and climbed into the passenger seat. For the first few minutes, he talked casually about school and the weather. Then his tone became more serious. I heard you've been spending a lot of time with the guidance counselor. My chest tightened. I hadn't told anyone at home about those meetings. She helps students with college planning, I answered carefully. He nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. Be careful who you take advice from, he said. Not everyone understands our family. I looked out the window, saying nothing. He hadn't accused me of anything. He hadn't raised his voice. But somehow, he already knew I had started asking questions. And for the first time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was quietly watching every move I made. For the next few days, I became much more careful. I stopped mentioning where I went after school unless someone asked. I no longer left papers or notes lying around in my room. Even the small notebook from my teacher stayed hidden somewhere new every few days. Maybe I was being overly cautious. Maybe I wasn't. But once you begin feeling like your choices are being watched, it's hard to ignore that feeling. Wednesday afternoon, my phone buzzed during biology class. It was a message from my mother. Don't make any plans for Friday evening. The Harrison family invited us over. I stared at the screen for several seconds before putting the phone away. Another dinner. Another evening where everyone else seemed excited except me. During lunch, I showed the message to my guidance counselor. She read it quietly before handing my phone back. "You still have time," she said. "Nothing has happened yet, but if that changes, promise me you'll tell someone immediately." I nodded. "I promise." Friday arrived faster than I wanted. As soon as I got home, my mother was already waiting upstairs with a garment bag hanging from the closet door. Inside was another new dress, light blue, more expensive than anything I'd ever owned. "Try it on," she said with a smile. "It looks beautiful on you." I stood in front of the mirror after changing, barely recognizing the girl staring back at me. My mother adjusted the sleeves and stepped back proudly. "Perfect," she whispered. I wanted to ask why any of this mattered so much. Instead, I stayed silent. 20 minutes later, we arrived at the Harrisons' home. Their house was elegant but welcoming, filled with laughter and the smell of fresh food. Everyone greeted us warmly. Daniel walked over almost immediately. "Good to see you again," he said politely. "You too," I replied. Unlike the adults, he didn't seem interested in pretending everything was perfectly normal. As dinner went on, our parents encouraged us to talk. We ended up sitting on the back patio while everyone else remained inside. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said after a long silence. "Sure. If nobody else had arranged any of this, would you even be here tonight?" I looked at him honestly. "Probably not." He smiled, not because the answer made him happy, but because it was honest. "Same." We both laughed quietly for the first time. It broke some of the awkwardness. "I don't think you're a bad person," I admitted. "Neither do I," he replied. "I just don't like feeling like someone else already wrote my future." Those words stayed with me. We weren't enemies. We were two teenagers caught in expectations neither of us had created. Before we could continue, our parents called us back inside. Dessert had been served, and the conversation quickly shifted toward college, careers, and family traditions. Then Daniel's father smiled across the table. "It's nice seeing young people spend time together." "They seem comfortable." Several adults nodded in agreement. My father looked pleased. I suddenly realized they were interpreting our normal conversation as proof that everything was working exactly as planned. On the drive home, nobody spoke until we were only a few minutes from the house. Then my father finally broke the silence. "You handled yourself well tonight." "Thank you," I answered. "We'll plan another visit soon," he continued. "There's no need to rush anything, but building a strong connection takes time." My hands tightened around the seatbelt. Another visit, then another, and another after that. I could see the path they had imagined stretching farther into the future, one careful step at a time. That weekend, I couldn't stop thinking about it. On Sunday afternoon, I opened my laptop and started researching universities in other states. Schools far enough away that living at home wouldn't be an option. Scholarships. Student housing. Financial aid. The idea felt impossible, until I realized thousands of students did exactly that every year. For the first time, leaving home didn't feel like running away. It felt like building a future. Monday morning, I met with my guidance counselor again. When I told her I wanted to apply to colleges outside Arizona, she smiled. "Now we're talking about your goals." We spent almost an hour discussing application deadlines, scholarships, and entrance exams. As I walked out of her office, I felt lighter than I had in months. But that feeling disappeared the moment I reached my locker. Taped neatly to the front was a small white envelope with my name written across it. There was no stamp, no return address. Someone had left it there by hand. I looked around the hallway. Students were laughing, talking, hurrying to class. Nobody seemed to be paying attention to me. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded note. It contained only one sentence. "Some dreams bring families closer. Others tear them apart. Choose carefully." I read it twice before folding it shut. I didn't know who had written it, but one thing was suddenly very clear. Someone else knew I had started dreaming about a different future. The note stayed in my pocket for the rest of the day. I read it again during lunch, hoping I'd somehow missed another clue, but there was nothing else. No signature. No handwriting I recognized, just that one sentence. Some dreams bring families closer. Others tear them apart. Choose carefully. I showed it to my guidance counselor before my last class. She studied it for a few seconds before asking, "Did anyone see you open it?" I shook my head. "Do you know who could have left it?" "No." She placed the note back on her desk. "It could mean a lot of things, but don't ignore it. If anything else unusual happens, let me know immediately." I agreed, although I wasn't sure what else there was to say. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone from my family had found out I was thinking about colleges outside the state, or maybe I was simply becoming paranoid. That evening, I decided not to tell my parents about the note. The fewer people who knew what I was thinking, the better. Instead, I focused on school. My grades had always been good, but now they became my priority. Every high score felt like another step toward independence. Every completed assignment reminded me that my future wasn't completely out of reach. 2 weeks passed without another surprise. Life settled into a routine. School, homework, family dinners, occasional visits with relatives. On the surface, everything looked peaceful again. Then, one Thursday afternoon, my principal's secretary walked into my English class and quietly asked me to come to the office. My first thought was that something had happened to one of my parents. My heart pounded all the way down the hallway. Instead, I found both of my parents sitting in the principal's office, smiling politely. "You're not in trouble," the principal assured me. "Your parents wanted to discuss your academic plans." Academic plans. I looked at my guidance counselor, who was also in the room. She seemed just as surprised as I was. My father spoke first. "We've been discussing colleges at home." That wasn't true. We had never discussed colleges. "We think it's best if she stays close to family after graduation," he continued. "There are several excellent universities nearby." My guidance counselor smiled professionally. "Of course, that's one option, but she has the grades to be competitive almost anywhere." My father nodded politely, though I noticed his smile tighten ever so slightly. "Family is important to us." "Absolutely," the counselor replied, "but ultimately applications should reflect the student's own goals." The room fell quiet for a moment. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice, yet the tension was impossible to ignore. As soon as the meeting ended, my parents drove me home. Halfway there, my father finally spoke. "You never mentioned applying out of state." I looked straight ahead. "I was only researching options." "There's no reason to look so far away," he answered calmly. "Everything you need is here." I wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that what I needed most was the chance to decide for myself, but I stayed silent. That night, I logged into my email to continue researching scholarships. One message immediately caught my attention. "Congratulations." My heart skipped. It wasn't an acceptance letter. It was an invitation to attend a weekend leadership program at a university in Colorado. Students from across the country had been selected based on academic performance. Travel assistance was included. It was only a 3-day event, but to me, it felt like a glimpse of another life. A place where nobody knew my family. Nobody expected anything from me except to learn. The application deadline was only 5 days away. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Then I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door. I quickly minimized the email just as my mother knocked softly. "Can I come in?" she asked. "Of course." She entered carrying a basket of freshly folded laundry. As she placed it on my bed, her eyes drifted toward my laptop screen. "Doing homework?" she asked casually. "Just looking at school stuff," I replied. She smiled. "Good, your father and I love seeing you work hard." She walked toward the door, then stopped. Without turning around, she quietly said, "Just remember, no opportunity is worth losing your family." The door closed behind her. I stared at the screen for several long seconds before reopening the email. Suddenly, applying to that program felt like much more than filling out a form. It felt like the first real decision of my life. I spent the entire evening staring at the application. My finger hovered over the submit button more times than I could count. It wasn't fear of rejection that stopped me. It was fear of being accepted. If I got in, I'd have to explain why I wanted to leave Arizona for an entire weekend. I already knew my parents wouldn't like the idea. Still, something inside me refused to close the page. Before going to bed, I completed every section of the application except the final confirmation. "I'll decide tomorrow," I whispered to myself. The next morning, I arrived at school earlier than usual. I showed the application to my guidance counselor, who read it carefully before smiling. "This is a fantastic opportunity," she said. "Students from programs like this often receive scholarship offers later." Hearing that only made the decision harder. "My parents won't agree," I admitted. She paused for a moment before asking, "Have you actually asked them?" I looked away. "No." "Then don't answer for them before giving them the chance." It sounded reasonable, but deep down I wasn't convinced. That afternoon, I finally pressed submit. A confirmation email appeared instantly. My heart started racing. There was no turning back now. 3 days later, another email arrived while I was eating lunch at school. "Congratulations, you have been selected." For a second, the cafeteria noise disappeared. I read the sentence again just to make sure it was real. Travel expenses were covered. Housing was provided on campus. The only thing I needed was a signed permission form from a parent. My excitement faded almost immediately. The permission form. I folded the paper and slipped it into my backpack. All afternoon, I rehearsed different ways to bring it up. Maybe after dinner. Maybe over the weekend. Maybe when my father was in a particularly good mood. Every option sounded risky. That evening, as luck would have it, my father seemed unusually relaxed. Dinner had gone well, everyone was laughing, and even my younger cousins had stopped by for dessert. I decided this was probably the best chance I was going to get. "Dad," I said carefully, "our school recommended me for a leadership program." He looked up from his coffee. "A leadership program? Yes, it's only one weekend. Students from different states." "Where?" "Colorado." The room became quiet. My mother slowly placed her cup on the table. My father leaned back in his chair. "And who would be supervising this trip?" I explained everything I knew. Teachers, university staff, chaperones, organized activities. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he smiled politely. "I'm proud they recognized your hard work." Relief washed over me. Then he continued. "But the answer is no." I blinked. "May I ask why?" "You don't need to leave the state to become successful." "It's only 3 days. 3 days is still 3 days." My mother finally spoke. "There will be many opportunities closer to home." I looked from one parent to the other. "This could help with scholarships." "We'll help you with college," my father replied calmly. "I want to earn it myself." The words escaped before I had time to stop them. The atmosphere changed instantly. Nobody raised their voice, nobody argued, but I could feel the distance growing between us. My father stood up from the table. "We'll discuss this another time." The conversation was over. The next morning, I had to tell my guidance counselor that I couldn't attend. She looked genuinely disappointed. "I'm sorry," she said. "So am I." She was quiet for a moment before asking, "Do your parents usually make every major decision for you?" I hesitated. "Most of them." She nodded slowly, as though another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. "You know," she said, "there's a difference between parents giving advice and parents making every choice." I didn't answer, because I already knew she was right. Later that afternoon, as I emptied my locker before heading home, someone called my name. I turned around. It was Daniel. He looked unusually serious. "Can we talk for a minute?" I nodded. He glanced around the hallway to make sure nobody from either of our families was nearby. Then he quietly said something I never expected to hear. "My parents told me they're planning an engagement announcement." I felt the color drain from my face. He shook his head immediately. "I told them I wasn't ready." I stared at him. "They didn't listen." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he looked me straight in the eyes. "I think they're making plans without either of us." The date on the invitation kept replaying in my mind all the way home. 3 weeks. That was all the time everyone else believed they needed to decide the rest of my life. I held the invitation in my hands while my father drove in complete silence. When we finally pulled into the driveway, he turned off the engine and looked at me. "You don't have to say anything today," he said calmly. "Just think about it." I nodded without answering and walked straight to my room. The invitation stayed on my desk for hours. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but I couldn't stand looking at it either. Later that night, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Did they give you one too?" I stared at the screen before replying. "Yes." His answer came almost immediately. "I didn't know they were printing invitations already." My heart sank. Neither did I. A few seconds passed before another message appeared. "Can we meet tomorrow after school? Somewhere our families won't expect." I hesitated for only a moment before typing, "Okay." The next afternoon, we met at a small public park a few blocks away from school. It wasn't crowded, which made talking easier. Daniel looked exhausted. "I argued with my parents last night," he admitted. "I've never done that before." "What happened?" I asked. He sighed. I told them I wasn't ready for any engagement, and they acted like I was throwing away the best opportunity of my life. I couldn't help giving a small, tired laugh. "It sounds familiar," he nodded. Then my dad said something that really bothered me. "What?" Daniel looked down at the ground before answering. He said, "You'll understand later, this isn't just about you." We sat in silence for a few moments. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me for weeks. "What do you actually want?" He didn't hesitate. "I want to finish college, I want to build my own career, and if I ever get married, I want it to be because both people choose it." I smiled sadly. That's exactly what I want too. We both realized the irony at the same time. Neither of us was trying to hurt our families. We simply wanted the chance to make our own decisions. Before leaving, Daniel looked at me seriously. "Whatever happens, I don't want anyone forcing you into something you don't want." I appreciated his honesty, but it also made me realize how serious everything had become. The following Monday, my guidance counselor asked if I had made any progress with my parents. I shook my head. "They've already started planning." She looked concerned. "Have they given you a date?" I quietly placed the invitation on her desk. She read it carefully, then looked back at me. "Have you agreed to this?" "No." "Have they asked whether you agree?" I slowly shook my head again. She took a deep breath. "Then we need to make sure your voice doesn't get lost in everyone else's plans." Before I left her office, she handed me another envelope. Inside was information about early college admission, housing assistance, and several scholarship deadlines that were only weeks away. "Don't stop planning your future," she said, "even if other people are making plans too." As I walked toward my locker, I felt my phone vibrate again. This time it wasn't my parents. It was an unknown number. The message contained only 6 words. "They know you're trying to leave." The message stayed on my screen for several seconds before I finally locked my phone. "They know you're trying to leave." No name, no number I recognized, just 6 words that made my heart race. I looked around the hallway, wondering if someone was watching me, but students hurried past like it was any other afternoon. I slipped the phone into my pocket and headed straight to my guidance counselor's office. She read the message carefully before handing the phone back. "We can't assume who sent it," she said. "It could be someone trying to scare you. But from now on, don't face this alone." She suggested that I save every message, avoid deleting anything, and let trusted adults know if more appeared. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about one family dinner anymore. It was about making sure I had people who would stand beside me if things became more complicated. That evening, I expected another uncomfortable conversation at home, but none came. My parents acted as though everything was perfectly normal. We ate dinner together, talked about school, and even laughed over an old family story. The silence made me more nervous than an argument would have. 2 days later, Daniel texted me again. "Can we meet one last time before the event?" I agreed. We met at the same park where we'd talked before. He looked calmer than the last time, but also more certain. "I finally told my parents exactly how I feel," he said. "How did they take it?" I asked. He gave a small smile. "Not well, but at least now they know the truth." I admired his courage. Then he looked at me. "You deserve the chance to tell your family the truth too." His words stayed with me all weekend. The evening of the celebration arrived faster than I wanted. Both families gathered in a large banquet hall decorated with flowers and soft lights. Everyone seemed excited. People laughed, took pictures, and congratulated one another. I stood near the back of the room, watching it all unfold as if I were watching someone else's life. Then my father walked onto the small stage at the front of the room and tapped a glass with a spoon. The room grew quiet. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "Tonight we celebrate friendship, family, and the future." My heart pounded. He looked toward me with a proud smile. "Before we continue, I'd like my daughter to join me." Every eye in the room turned toward me. My legs felt heavy as I slowly walked to the front. My father smiled, expecting me to stand beside him. Instead, I gently took the microphone from his hand. The room fell completely silent. I took a deep breath. "I love my family," I began. "Everything you've done has always come from wanting the best for me, and I'll always be grateful for that." I looked around the room before continuing. "But there's something I need everyone to understand." My voice shook for a moment, but I didn't stop. "The future belongs to the person who has to live it." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. "I respect Daniel and I respect his family, but neither of us is ready to make promises about the rest of our lives. We both want to finish school, build our own futures, and make those decisions when the time is right." I looked toward Daniel. He slowly stood up. "She's telling the truth," he said. "I feel the same way." wave of whispers spread across the room. My parents looked stunned. Daniel's parents exchanged worried glances. For a long moment, nobody knew what to say. Then my grandfather slowly stood. He looked at me for several seconds before speaking. "When I was young," he said quietly, "I thought love meant making every decision for the people you cared about. Maybe. Sometimes love also means trusting them to make their own." The room remained silent. My father lowered his eyes. Finally, he stepped forward. "I may not understand every choice you make," he said softly, "but you're still my daughter." Tears filled my eyes. It wasn't a perfect ending. Not everyone agreed. Not every disagreement disappeared overnight. But that evening, something changed. Nobody announced an engagement. Nobody asked for promises. Instead, the celebration ended with conversations that should have happened from the beginning. A year later, I packed my bags for college. Daniel was leaving for a different university in another state. We hugged goodbye as friends, wishing each other success. As my parents helped load the last suitcase into the car, my father smiled and handed me a small envelope. Inside was the same invitation from months earlier. Across the front, he had written one new sentence in blue ink. "Your future is yours. Make it a good one." For the first time, I smiled without pretending. And as we drove toward my new beginning, I realized freedom didn't start the day I left home. It started the moment I found the courage to speak for myself. The days leading up to the celebration felt heavier than ever. Every morning, I woke up hoping something would change. Every night, I went to bed knowing nothing had. My parents spoke about the event as if it were simply another family gathering. They discussed the menu, the guest list, and the decorations. Nobody mentioned how I felt. It was as though my silence had already been accepted as agreement. Meanwhile, I quietly kept working toward the future I wanted. My college applications were finished. Scholarship essays had been submitted. My guidance counselor helped me organize every deadline on a calendar, reminding me that no matter what happened at home, my future didn't have to stop moving forward. Then, just 4 days before the celebration, an email arrived. I stared at the subject line for several seconds before opening it. Congratulations! I had been accepted into one of my top choice universities. Even better, they had offered me a scholarship that covered almost everything. For the first time in months, I cried. Not because I was sad, because I finally saw a door opening. But I didn't tell my parents, not yet. I wasn't hiding the news because I wanted to deceive them. I was waiting until I was ready to speak without fear. The evening of the celebration finally arrived. The ballroom was filled with smiling faces, soft music, and relatives I hadn't seen in years. Everyone seemed excited. Everyone except Daniel and me. The moment we saw each other across the room, we exchanged the same nervous smile. Neither of us wanted to be there. Neither of us wanted to disappoint our families, but neither of us wanted someone else choosing our future. As dinner came to an end, my father walked toward the microphone. He thanked everyone for coming. He spoke about tradition, about family, about building a future together. Then he looked directly at me. "I'd like my daughter to join me." Every conversation in the room stopped. I slowly stood. Each step toward the stage felt heavier than the last. When I reached my father, he smiled proudly and handed me the microphone. For a moment, I simply stood there. I looked around the room, at my grandparents, my cousins, my aunts and uncles, at Daniel, at my parents. Then I took a deep breath. "I know everyone here loves me," I began. "And I know every decision you've made came from believing it was the right one." The room stayed silent. But love shouldn't replace someone's voice. I could hear my own heartbeat. I've spent my entire life trying to make everyone proud. I studied hard. I respected our family. I followed every rule. But there's one thing I can't give away: my future. No one interrupted. No one moved. I don't want anyone to feel embarrassed tonight. I don't want anyone to feel hurt. But I also can't stand here and pretend that decisions about my life have already been made. I reached into my purse and pulled out the university acceptance letter. "I've been accepted." A quiet wave of whispers spread through the room. "I've earned a scholarship." I looked directly at my parents. This isn't me walking away from my family, it's me walking toward the life I've worked for. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Daniel slowly stood. "I need to say something too." Every eye turned toward him. "I respect both of our families, I always will. But she shouldn't have to carry this conversation alone." He walked forward. "I've also decided to attend college. I don't want anyone planning my future before I've had the chance to build it myself." Silence filled the ballroom once again. This time, it lasted even longer. Finally, my grandfather stood. He looked at both of us before smiling sadly. "When I was your age," he said quietly, "I believed young people should always follow the path their elders chose for them. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe every generation deserves the chance to build its own future." My father remained silent for what felt like forever. Then he slowly walked toward me. "I don't agree with every decision you've made," he admitted, "but I can see how hard you've worked for this." He looked down at the acceptance letter before quietly saying, "You earned it." Tears filled my eyes. "Then go," he said. Those two words changed everything. Not because they solved every problem. They didn't. Healing our relationship took time. Some relatives needed months to accept my decision. A few never truly did. But from that night forward, nobody spoke about my future as though I wasn't in the room. 6 months later, I stood on a university campus hundreds of miles from home. Classes were challenging. Money was tight. There were days when I wondered whether I'd made the right decision. Then I remembered the girl who once believed she wasn't allowed to choose her own future. She felt like someone I barely recognized. One afternoon, my phone rang. It was my father. We talked about classes, my professors, and life on campus. Before hanging up, he paused for a moment and quietly said, "You sound happy." I smiled. "I am," he laughed softly. "I'm still learning." "So am I replied. We both laughed. It wasn't a perfect ending. It was something better. It was the beginning of a relationship built not on expectations, but on respect. And for the first time in my life, the future truly belonged to me.